My name is Melissa Widhalm. I am an operations manager with the Purdue Climate Change Research Center out of West Lafayette. I'm actually a meteorologist and climatologist by training, and now I work for Purdue University, primarily overseeing a project called the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment. There'll be a link to that at the end of the slides, but it's indianaclimate.org in case you're interested. So that's the primary project I work on, and we really try to answer a question: what does climate change mean for Indiana? And in doing that, we're working not just to put together a series of reports, which you'd see on that website, but also to elevate the conversation and dialogue about climate change here in our state. Now, that can be a bit of a struggle at times. So this is supposed to advance, is that right? No? Yes? Can you go to the next slide back there? Excellent. I'll just say next slide and then you can help me out. This isn't working. Try it again. It's working. Correction. So again, we're trying to elevate this conversation, which can be a bit of a challenge because when you say climate change or global warming, what comes to people's mind are often images like you see here, right? Some polar bear floating away, some landscape that's unfamiliar to what we see when we look out of our window, some time period that's not here today. And so, the point is climate change is not actually just a problem for faraway places and distant points in the future. In fact, it's already happening here in Indiana, and we're already feeling the impacts. And so a lot of what I try to do is help people make that connection between climate change and their day-to-day lives. So when they hear the phrase global warming or climate change, the images that come to mind are something that we can all relate to right here in Indiana. And so I have about 12 minutes or so. And in that time, before I turn it over to Nicole and Pat, I'm going to quickly go through a high-level overview of what we're seeing in the climate records on our past climate trends and what the science is telling us about future climate projections, and interweave a little bit about what that actually means for local food systems and food production here in Indiana. But before we talk hyper-local about climate, I want to zoom way out, like way out to outer space, looking at these two images just to give us some perspective on what we're talking about when we're talking about climate change. And so the image on the left, there's a blue marble, and that blue marble actually represents all of Earth's water. So if you took it from the depths of the ocean, ice caps, everything, crammed it together, it would fill a ball the size of that blue dot. And so our water is actually a pretty thin and fragile layer when we look at it like that. On the right is our atmosphere. That pink balloon is representing all of the air from the surface up to the top of the sky, all around the Earth, crammed together. And it's that pink balloon right there. Again, a fragile, thin layer. And just think, we're all breathing and driving and flying and running our factories and growing our food and doing our day-to-day business inside that pink balloon. Okay, all 7 billion of us on this planet. So when we start to think about our atmosphere in this way, it's a lot easier to really grasp how we could be having an impact, and that we could in fact be having an impact on our atmosphere. And that's just what we've been doing. So over the last, since the start of the Industrial Revolution, we've converted billions of tons of fossil fuels from flying and driving and growing food and transporting goods and all those things that power our modern lifestyle. We've been burning that energy, and it's been converted into carbon dioxide. We keep doing that over and over. It's a long-lived gas. That means the concentration of that gas goes up in our atmosphere. And so what we're looking at in red on this chart, that's the concentration of CO2, carbon dioxide, in our atmosphere. And in white, that's the change in Earth's temperature from year to year. You can see they very closely track one another. All right, and this concept of heat-trapping gases like carbon dioxide and Earth's temperature, this relationship is not new. Okay, we've known about this since the 1800s. And so since that time, we've actually seen Earth's temperature rise about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, how does this concept actually work, this greenhouse effect that we often hear about? It's pretty simplistic. Molecules like carbon dioxide and water vapor, methane, they're called greenhouse gases. I call them heat-trapping gases. They're interchangeably used. They're these special molecules that let light from the sun pass right through the atmosphere and heat up the Earth. But when the Earth starts to warm up, it radiates heat out to space. Those heat-trapping gases stop that heat from radiating out to space. So I like to think of it like a giant clear blanket wrapped around the Earth. And as we add more of those gases, it's like adding another blanket, even though we're already perfectly warm. Now, I just said that since the Industrial Revolution, we've warmed Earth's temperature about 2 degrees. Some people say, so what? What's the big deal about two degrees? That doesn't sound like very much, but it is. Let's not forget, we're talking about the climate, not the weather. So weather is a snapshot of what's happening at a specific time and place. The climate, on the other hand, is the long-term average of conditions. All right, so when we start talking about a shift in that long-term average, that's a pretty big deal. Earth's temperature is very, very stable. I like to think of it like our body temperature, okay? When you look at Earth's temperature over the course of a year, it actually just fluctuates a few tenths of a degree, up or down, up or down. So again, that long-term trend of 2 or 3 degrees of warming, that's a huge deal. That translates to some very dramatic shifts in our environment and some very dramatic shifts in our regional weather patterns. And we actually see it when we look at Indiana's climate record. We see it in our temperature, which shows that we're warmer about 1.3 degrees more than we were 125 years ago. That's associated with a longer frost-free season. That's associated with fewer cold days. Okay, we're a northern climate. Winter's not going away, but it's different than it used to be. That means significantly warmer overnight temperatures. Okay, so all of these things happen with just that 1.3 degree shift that we've already measured. We're already seeing changes in our precipitation record too. When we look at it, on average across the state, we get about 6.5 inches more rainfall now than we did 125 years ago. And that's coming in heavier rainfall events. It's happening more frequently, more intense. So we see pretty dramatic shifts here in our rainfall. If we switch to looking at what the information says about what the scientists are telling us about future temperature, the best available projections we have from scientists right here in Indiana tell us 5 to 6 degrees of warming is what we can expect here in Indiana over the next 30 to 50 years. Let that sink in. That is a tremendous amount of warming. Okay, remember, this is the climate, not the weather. Associated with that, we're talking about more hot days, a longer warm season, milder cold season. What do I mean when I say more hot days? What does that actually look like here in Allen County where we're sitting right now? I want to talk about heat stress, just to make this point. Heat stress days would be a day when temperature is at 86 degrees or higher. So we don't have to be talking about an astronomically warm day, 100 plus, something that is extremely rare to have heat impacts. We can just be talking about an 86 degree day, and we really start to see the impacts in our day-to-day lives. It's at 86 degrees and above where animals start seeing heat stress. If you have livestock, their production rates start going down, their fertility rates start going down. If we're talking about corn crops getting above that 86 degree threshold, that's stressful. That requires a lot more water. That can really have an impact on yields. People, right? It affects us too, whether it's the safety of outdoor workers, the safety of those without air conditioning, the air quality impacts that we see when the temperatures get north of 86 degrees. Right? So again, we don't have to be talking about ridiculously hot temperatures to have an impact. 86 degrees will do it. So when we in the past, we have, on average, 42 days here in Allen County where we see this heat stress. What happens if we warm that average temperature 5 to 6 degrees? Well, that means that we're going to see about a doubling, a little more than doubling of those heat stress days. Okay, that's what I mean when I say more high temperature days, more heat stress. What do I mean when I say warmer winters, a milder winter season? Let's look at this from the perspective of a perennial crop, something like peaches, grapes, apples, blueberries, any of these crops that rely on chilling hours. So you might say, well, what in the heck is a chilling hour? A chilling hour describes the amount of time that a perennial crop has to spend between 35 and 50 degrees. And it's extremely important because that's what readies it to break dormancy and to blossom. So if you have too few chilling hours, you're simply not going to bloom. So if your winter is warm enough that you don't spend enough time in that chilling hour zone, forget about it, you're not going to blossom. If you are accumulating these chilling hours too quickly, you are going to break your dormancy at the first sign of warmth in the early spring, and you are leaving yourself very vulnerable to a seasonal freeze, maybe in April or May. That happened in 2012, you might remember. We lost a lot of perennial crops that year because of this problem, right? We had a warm winter, chilling hour requirements were reached very quickly, everything started to blossom, killed off the crop when we froze in April. An April freeze is not unreasonable here. We expect it. If you have too much temperature fluctuation, it's going to reset your chilling hours. So when we have these erratic winters, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, now we're talking about erratic blooms, yield loss, reduced fruit quality, okay? These are real stresses that we have. We are already on the edge of suitability for a lot of perennial crop varieties here in Indiana, and a warming climate is only going to make it more difficult to reliably grow those crops. All right, I only have a couple minutes. I'm going to move quickly. I talked a lot about temperature, but precipitation is part of the story too. I said we're getting wetter. We expect that to continue. But looking at it annually isn't the full story. Okay, when we look at how we expect rainfall to shift seasonally, we're talking about some pretty dramatic increases in the cold season when we're going to have flood problems, soil erosion problems, having to deal with this water. And we're talking about some mild deficits at a time of the year when we have a lot of demand. Okay, so water stress is part of our future story. And when we take all of this together, remember, this doesn't happen in isolation. As we see these changes in temperature, precipitation, they lead to other changes throughout the system. Everything is interconnected. And so things like urban and rural food production will become stressed as you have weed, pest, and disease patterns shift in response to those temperature and rainfall shifts. We're going to see changes in soil health as we have more erosion from that heavy rainfall in the spring, as we see more carbon loss from the soil as those soil temperatures are warmer, right? All of these things, when you keep having moisture and heat stress, in the coming decades, they're really talking about some significant declines in corn and soybean yields, among other crops. And so to recap the dramatic amount of information that I just threw at you in the last 13 minutes, the bottom line is that we are getting warmer, we are getting wetter, and those trends are going to continue. And so we need to be figuring out how to manage for extreme heat, how to manage for extreme rainfall, what to do about these seasonal changes. But most importantly, we need to recognize that where we end up depends on the choices that we make, right? So we can, we already have changes underway. There are adaptations we can make that make us less vulnerable or that make us more vulnerable. There are adjustments that we, the big we, globally need to make to put us on the lower emission path so that we have a lower amount of warming, so that we have less dramatic shifts in our temperature. Or we don't, and we stay on the trajectory we're on today. So really, where we end up depends on the choices we make. All right, I've given you a lot. I'm going to hand it off to Nicole. We should have time, plenty of time for questions in just a few minutes. And with that, I'll just say thank you. Set this one up here.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Nicole Nelson. I am a lecturer at the University of St. Francis. One of the classes that I feel very lucky to be teaching is Introduction to Sustainable Food Systems. We actually just spent a lot of time last week talking about climate change and the impacts we're seeing on agriculture. We went through the whole Purdue site and looked at kind of what can be done to mitigate some of these impacts, how we're working with farmers to look at the future and help build some resilience for our farmers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about your carbon footprint. So what are the things that go into creating carbon emissions just with our personal diets? So food accounts for about 10 to 30% of a household's carbon footprint. And included in this total household food carbon footprint includes the production, the soil health of the soil that was used to produce that food, transportation, so thinking about food miles. That's what I have a picture of up there. So that's a grocery store actually in Madison, Wisconsin that I used to go to a lot. And that was a nice visual reminder of those food miles, seeing it printed in front of you. You can see that one was 257 to that farm where that food was coming from. So not only is it a reminder of, oh, eating local is important, but actually this visual of how far did my food travel. The processing involved in the food, refrigeration, so having to transport it in refrigerated vehicles, put it into another refrigerated unit, takes a lot of energy. Thinking about where you're eating on the food chain, also an important decision when it comes to carbon emissions. And food waste, so a lot of that energy that's used to produce food, if it doesn't get eaten, that's just being thrown away, right? And then creating more methane in the landfills. So when I was looking at these, I was wondering which of these accounts for the most carbon emissions. So if I'm making choices and trying to think about my food print, where should I be looking most closely? And while you should be taking into account all of these things, food production accounts for 68% of overall food emissions. So how food is grown, the soil that it's grown in, how livestock is raised, and what those different products are, is really what's the largest amount of this food print profile. This is just a quick visual showing kind of those different elements that make up our whole greenhouse gas emission profile. And you can see, that blue one, that blue one up towards the top, the light blue, that's the food waste. So that does contribute a significant amount that you would want to consider when you're grocery shopping. Are we throwing out too many things? Am I overbuying? How can I reduce my food waste? Definitely something to think about. And then you can see the green on the right. That is the agriculture and land percentage of overall greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so this is just a graphic that's looking at different types of foods and the carbon emissions per serving. So this is not to upset any livestock farmers, but beef is definitely the most intensive when you think about carbon emissions. So if you're thinking about how can I immediately change my carbon footprint overnight, definitely considering the amount of meat, particularly beef, versus vegetables and legumes that are on your plate. This is a similar graph, just showing it in a different way, but meat and dairy are the vast majority of contributors to greenhouse gas emissions from just food production. Okay, so just thinking about how can I reduce my footprint, reducing meat consumption. I'm sure that's a kind of overall public health initiative. Reducing food waste. I know we have organizations in our community that work to help redirect food so it's not going into the landfill and creating more emissions. Considering soil health, that's a big one, and that's something that I've become really interested in, thinking about soil as a complex ecosystem and being able to actually soak that carbon into the soil, sequester it in the soil. We have several farmers in the area who do a really excellent job with this, and I believe they're probably upstairs talking about it right now. There is a experiment out at Seven Sons when I've taken classes out for field trips, and he compares his soil to his neighbor's who's a conventional farmer, and you can literally see the soil quality and how that soil is then better able to sequester carbon into it with deep roots from native prairie plants. And then the last one, of course, is eating locally. So we're reducing that amount of transportation, reducing the refrigeration hours, and that does make a difference in our footprint, our overall footprint. So that's what I have for you guys. I'm going to bring Pat up next.
Nicole, you want your mask? Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? My name is Pat Carney, and I am with the City of Fort Wayne. I started with the city in city utilities in May of 2020, and my main focus has been to create the first climate action plan for the City of Fort Wayne. So I'm pretty excited to be here today. Janet, thank you very much for the invitation to talk a little bit about the climate action plan with you. Prior to coming to the city, I worked in a number of engineering and operations management positions in a number of sectors, both in manufacturing and logistics and distribution. So let's get right into the climate action plan. It is under review. We're hoping to get it fully reviewed by the end of this year. And a climate action plan is also referred to as a CAP, just a CAP. Before I get into the CAP, I want to talk about some definitions. And one of the ladies this morning asked a question about that in terms of the definitions. Sometimes we use definitions and everybody doesn't understand what we're talking about in terms of that particular term. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about a few terms. Resilience, mitigation, and adaptation. We use those terms all the time when we're talking about a CAP. So the first one is resilience. Resilience, the definition is how do we build a system or organization to respond or recover readily from a crisis. And I think my coworkers here, or co-speakers, talked about a couple of things. I know Melissa mentioned extreme heat events, extreme precipitation events. How quickly do we respond when we have a flood event or a huge snowfall? Mitigation is another term that we use quite often when we talk about a CAP. Mitigation, as it relates to a climate action plan, is how do we reduce our carbon dioxide emissions, also known as greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide emissions, also known as our carbon footprint. So our carbon dioxide emission is up here. What do we do to bring it down here? Those mitigation strategies. And the other term is adaptation. What do we need to do to adapt to those higher temperatures and more frequent and heavier rain events? So those three terms, resilience, adaptation, and mitigation, are used throughout the CAP. You can look at the screen up there, and under mitigation, there's some examples of what mitigation actually means. Sustainable transportation, and that's a really good one that's easy to understand. Most of us probably got here today by using a gas-powered car. I did, okay? What's an alternative form of transportation? Perhaps walking, riding your bike, maybe taking mass transit where you use a city bus where it transports 20 or 30 people versus a single passenger vehicle car, or perhaps an electric vehicle. Clean energy is another strategy under mitigation, and that would also be renewable energy, solar, wind, nuclear, or biogas. And I'll talk a little bit more about biogas. The last one there is energy efficiency. How can we use our energy more efficiently? Good example there is instead of a standard light bulb, convert to LED. Those are all mitigation strategies. Under adaptation, infrastructure upgrades, the city's continually working on those, and anyone that actually lives in the city of Fort Wayne, flood control is near and dear to all of our hearts, being a city of 3 rivers. Now in that center section is where mitigation and adaptation actually overlap. And I think the easiest example of that is planting a tree. A tree not only reduces that carbon dioxide in the environment, but it also helps us to adapt. We're standing outside on a sunny day, that sun's beating down on us. We stand under the tree, we've adapted to that higher temperature. That tree provides shade for us. And I'm sure Melissa could probably talk about some soil, or maybe Nicole could talk about the soil that the tree also helps. So it also does some good things for the soil. There's another term that I want to talk about, and it's not up on the slide there, but one of my friends pointed it out when I was reviewing this presentation with her. She said, Pat, you always talk about sustainability. And sustainability is kind of the big umbrella. And the best definition of sustainability that I found was from 1987, the UN World Commission on Environment and Development. And that definition is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So that speaks volumes to make sure what we do today doesn't adversely impact those tomorrow, the kids, the grandkids, nieces, nephews. So what is a CAP, and why is it important for the city of Fort Wayne to have a CAP? A CAP is traditionally a plan to identify strategies to reduce or mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. Fort Wayne's CAP also includes adaptation strategies and strategies to promote environmentally sustainable infrastructure. So we've included a couple of other areas within our climate action plan. We've got 3 tools that we used to create our CAP, and they're listed there. The Greenhouse Gas Inventory Report, which was completed in 2018, and that basically is a tool that identifies what is our carbon footprint, or what is the total carbon dioxide emissions for the community and the city. It's broken up into 5 different sectors, and within each one of those sectors, we've identified mitigation strategies to reduce those carbon dioxide emissions. Second tool that we used is called the Hoosier Resilience Readiness Assessment. The Readiness Assessment is a tool that was provided to us by the Indiana University Environmental Resilience Institute. It's based on 8 different categories. We're going to focus on the agriculture and food category. Within those categories, there's 22 different climate impacts that are specific to Fort Wayne and the surrounding community. Within those 22 climate impacts, there's questions that are on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being we don't really have an action in place to address that impact, up to a 5 where we have a fully vetted plan that people understand, and we update that plan on a regular basis. My role in helping to facilitate and create this CAP was to work with over 50 city and county personnel and some outside organizations to identify how to answer those questions. And the last tool that we have that we used to create the climate action plan was Envision. And Envision is a tool that is administered by the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure to promote the use of environmentally sustainable infrastructure by planners, designers, engineers, contractors, and communities overall. So these are the responses from the readiness assessment for the category food and agriculture and impact number 11. Increased likelihood of short-term and long-term food shortages of the local and global food supply. The 4 recommendations that are under review are a summary of those responses from those city, county, and outside organization personnel. So the first one, review policies and programs to conserve and protect farmland, identify zoning codes and ordinances that could be updated to better support food production. The second one, and it was interesting because this ties right into some of the morning sessions that I heard, and actually Janet mentioned local food procurement a couple of times. Create a centralized group to coordinate efforts to support local food procurement community-wide. The recommendation is the city will partner with local organizations such as the Community Harvest Food Bank, Purdue Fort Wayne Pantry, or perhaps Allen County Soil and Water Conservation District. The third bullet item, create an emergency food plan. There's a number of organizations, and probably a lot of people sitting here today, who help support emergency food on a day-to-day basis in the city of Fort Wayne and surrounding area. But there's no overall comprehensive plan. So that might be one of those tasks that centralized group actually focuses on. And then the last bullet item, create a formal plan to track, map, divert, and recapture local sources of primary and consumer food waste. Once again, there's a number of organizations that work on this on a daily basis. The Allen County Department of Environmental Management has been working with local businesses and the local food bank to recapture some food. The local food bank has done some work with farmers to get unused food out of the field. The Indiana Recycling Coalition has been working on food waste diversion methods as well. The city of Fort Wayne started the Resource Recovery Program in 2015, which converts waste material from businesses into methane gas that's used at the water pollution control plant that is then turned into a renewable energy source for some of the city facilities. Next month, in October, we have plans to implement the Fats, Oils, and Grease Cooperative to assist restaurants and local food service establishments in the disposition of the fog to be processed at the water pollution control plant, which will further increase our biogas production. And then in 2022, there are plans in place for the city to start accepting solid organic waste to divert that solid food from our landfills. So once again, take that methane gas that doesn't help us if it just goes off in the atmosphere and bring it to actually produce renewable energy. So these are 3 initiatives to divert waste from our landfills to create a renewable energy. So these are 4 strategies that are a combination of both mitigation and adaptation that will make our food systems more resilient as our community faces more severe weather events in the months to come. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate it. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Nicole for Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both so much. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to start us off with? Yes. I'm going to bring the mic since they're recording.
I appreciated a mention of soil from each of you, and wondered, Melissa, if there was a dot on the first, or a bubble on the first slide that you showed of topsoil for the earth. Do you have any idea what that dot would look like? You showed the atmosphere and the water, and I'm wondering about topsoil, knowing that that's a critical.
It's going to be small.
Yeah, it's much smaller than the water one.
Very much. Yeah.
Yeah. So the follow-up question is, like, are there cross sections of city planning that can also increase our topsoil, and I know that we don't do a lot of agriculture here in the city limits, but wondering if soil is a part of the CAP plan.
That's a great question, and that's one of those things that would be brought. That's a great question, and that's one of those things that would be brought back to one of those central groups to talk about specifically soil. So once the climate action plan becomes public, it would be one of those great things for you to volunteer and say, hey, I'd like to put my 2 cents worth in.
Okay, I'm going to say one more thing about the soil, just a shameless plug for a new series that we released last week called Farming for a Better Climate. If you go to purdue.edu/climate, that's purdue.edu/climate, you'll link to it, find a link to it on the homepage. And we do have new stories released every week. And so if you're not familiar with the soil health aspects of farming and climate and the connections there, we do have a couple of stories this week and in the next 2 weeks that really focus on soil health, cover crops, and reduced tillage and how those can help us with emissions reductions. So, like I said, shameless plug, had to do it. Thank you.
Did you happen to talk to the Soil and Water Conservation District? They're,
Not today, but I mean, there are things that, just with the biosolids, or you were talking about capturing more food waste, I mean, that's a great opportunity for building up soil in our county.
yeah, they have an initiative right now looking at urban soils and small farms to improve soil health, so that might be a good resource too. Stop by, and they have cover crop seeds for your gardens right now, so yeah.
So I have a couple of questions and a couple of comments. So I'm also the regional urban soil health specialist for the Soil and Water Conservation Districts. It is a new program just launched this year, and we are working on developing a working group with partners from producers as well as our district folks and institutional folks. So am looking for more volunteers, Kimberly. So definitely reaching out for people who are interested in doing site assessments and helping to establish events where we can do more educational stuff and distribute, again, more cover crops. But I had two questions that I wanted to ask, kind of leading questions. The first one is, the beef and why is it such an environmental kind of a no-no? And my kind of answer to that is, it's not necessarily the beef, but the process and the production and the fact that all of that is consolidated and monopolized in a system that is out of control. And so I don't necessarily know that the beef itself is the worst thing. It's how the beef is raised and processed, because there's a lot of environmentally friendly beef that's, grass-fed, pasture-raised, and, harvested and processed locally that has a very, very, much lower environmental impact. But the other question that I had was, I didn't hear anyone talk about like the carbon sequestration and that sort of emerging conversation, and that's something that I've been hearing a lot about. And I'm kind of curious if anyone has any thoughts or any input that they'd like to add, and then I would love to connect with you, Pat, before you leave.
Okay.
I'll take the beef one, and then you can think about the second question. Yeah, you're right. There's absolutely different ways to raise beef and other meat that's going to have different carbon emissions. I think in my mind, I think also of trophic levels. And so every trophic level you go up in the food chain, 90% of the energy is lost. So depending on your environment and what you can grow, if you're eating at that first trophic level, then a lot more of that energy is going towards your body instead of going to the next, link in the food chain. So eating lower on the lower trophic levels does save energy that way. So trophic levels is just the amount of energy at each chain in the food web. So if you're thinking about food chains, and it's kind of like this pyramid, if you have like a big field of soybeans, let's say, and then the next trophic level would be those herbivores that are eating the soybeans. And then you'll have your next one. So each one of those levels, 90% of the energy is lost just through our own metabolism. So, yeah. But yeah, absolutely. I often think about, like Hoffman Organics or Seven Sons or Gunthorpe, and the way that they are raising meat is very different than a CAFO farm, right? Right, and I'm not even saying, oh, everyone should be vegan. I was just in East Africa this summer and seeing that landscape, which is just like scrubby brush. Of course, I mean, I can't eat that and digest it. So the Maasai people raise cattle because the cattle and goats can eat that and turn it into meat, right? So it's easy for me to say that here when we have plentiful food and options, but not everywhere in the world. It doesn't make sense to be a vegetarian, yeah. Yes, you're right. I didn't get into that very well, yeah. Okay.
Just because I have the microphone, I'm going to start talking. So one other thing on beef, what's really interesting is there are research projects to try to understand if you can have additives to the beef feed, the cattle feed, to reduce the amount of methane that come out. And seaweed is really something that can help. Well, we don't live near an ocean, right? So the cows don't want to eat it because it's not good. So I think there are a lot of different ways that people are trying to look at this, because you're right. For some people, taking that out of their diet is not a reasonable adjustment. That's something in my household I might get kicked out of my house for doing if I did that. But there are, so I always tell people the advice that I give is that, you make changes where you can based on what's reasonable for you, your dietary needs, your household needs, your budget, and all of those things. But I'm hopeful that some of the research that's coming out can help us with some of those emissions on beef cattle. Relating to your question on soil sequestration, so when we talk about soil sequestration, right, we're talking about taking the carbon out of the atmosphere, storing it in the soil long term. And there's a lot of buzz right now to pay farmers to be able to do that, right? Farmers are already doing that with a lot of their practices. Can we compensate them for doing it on more acres, right? So when I'm saying I'm talking about cover crops, I'm talking about reduced tillage, I'm talking about some of these strategies that don't just reduce the emissions, but they actively pull it out of the atmosphere and store it or sequester it in the ground. It's been described as the Wild West, right? The markets are very, very early. There are a lot of questions with how we validate what people are doing. How do we properly compensate? How do we know that what people are being paid for is actually happening? How do we know how long it takes for those benefits to happen? And what happens if there's an emergency and we have to take those crops out? Now what happens to all the gains we made? So there's a lot that's unknown. So it's something that I would recommend everybody pay attention to. It's something that is not going to be the end-all be-all, right? We have a lot of opportunity to store carbon in our soil. We don't have enough opportunity to completely remedy our climate change issues, right? So I think agriculture has a big role to play. I think agriculture is a lot smaller footprint than a lot of other industries, right? If we look here in the US, it's about 10% of emissions coming from agriculture. We have a lot of ground that we can make up, and we can pull out and store a lot of that carbon. We can't do it for all of it. So pay attention to this space, because it is evolving, and there's a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot of unknowns. So Purdue has a Center for Commercial Agriculture. They are a wonderful group that is trying to make sense and heads of tails of this Wild West and what kind of practices actually are useful. Where do you get the most bang for your buck? What are the unknowns? What is the role of government versus private sector for developing and regulating these markets? So again, it's really unknown, but it's something to pay attention to.
I've been hearing things about injection, sequestration, and ammonia and stuff, which just sounds pretty horrifying.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of like carbon capture and storage that people talk about. That's even more terrifying. People don't think about what happens when you have a large leak of ammonia or a large leak of, these pipelines that are supposed to be transporting carbon dioxide that we have now liquefied and are trying to store underground, right? It can be terrifying. So there's no simple solution. If there was, we wouldn't be here talking about this. This would have already been solved. So, yeah, it's a challenge.
Are you good, Rowan?
We do have one in the way back. I'm going to pass it to you in case you had anything else to say about soil. Because if I keep holding the mic, I'll
You're
keep
done.
talking.
It was already covered. Somebody else had asked the same question.
Do you have another one? Oh, okay.
Pat, I am glad you're here. Welcome. It sounds like you are the first person to initiate a CAP policy for our county. Is that right, or city?
I didn't initiate it. I just got hired to do it.
But
It was
you're
somebody else's idea.
But this is the first plan.
Yes, this is the first climate action plan for the city of Fort Wayne. Yes.
I'm also excited to meet you. My name's Kimberly, and one of the organizations I'm with is the Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light organization that works on climate change work throughout the state. And how many other cities or counties around the state are also in this process of doing these plans? And what kind of political will and finances are there to support the plan?
The first question, when I was involved with the Indiana University ERI, Environmental Resilience Institute cohort, last year there were 14 cities that were actively working on CAP. This year, since we've already got our CAP pretty well done, I think there's another 15. So I want to say 20, give or take. That's about right? Yeah. So probably about 20 throughout the entire state. And they're in various stages of writing, implementation, so on and so forth. To answer your next question, what kind of financial backing is there?
Political will.
Yeah, it is under review right now, and beyond that, I really don't know. It is under review right now. I personally hope that it gets accepted and, we move forward with it, because it does have a full plan in place for implementation and such. It covers, just like I said, the mitigation, the adaptation, the environment and sustainable infrastructure. So it's much more comprehensive than most climate action plans, which pretty much focus just on the mitigation piece. It has, I think, about 80 actionable things for various groups to do. And that might sound like a lot, but when you think about the entire city government, it's pretty big. So it's under review right now, and beyond that, I don't know yet.
Thank you.
Got a question in the back? Did that answer your question?
Yes.
More to come.
How can we support you in increasing the political will?
So, yeah, once again, like Kimberly said, thank you for coming here and being a part of creating this, the CAP, and helping to implement it, I assume, sustainability services. So my question is around that implementation piece, and while I understand that it's still under review, maybe that hasn't been developed, but I was wondering if there's been any conversation around ways to either encourage or regulate those organizations you were saying there's a space for them to step in. Has that conversation reached the table yet? What's to bring other people that could participate to the table?
That conversation hasn't happened yet.
Once the plan's been approved, then?
So I know this is a conversation about soil health, but since you brought up alternative transportation, and you work in city utilities, I'm going to ask you, why don't we have any underground transportation, public transit? If we're able to do the Mama Joe drill, why couldn't we do something similar to do an underground subway or something like that here?
I have no idea. That's an awesome question. I will take it back. I have no idea. No idea at all. Yeah, I mentioned the sustainable transportation as a description for mitigation. But yeah, it's I believe if you look at the all-in-one Allen County plan, that was actually listed a couple of times.
Did you list it? Yeah, I listed it. It was her,
You listed it? Yeah, I remember seeing it there.
among other things.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Pat, I guess I was just wondering, and maybe Kimberly said this to you, but is there a way for people in the community to help push this forward since it's under review?
Who can you nag? Oh, boy, that's a loaded question.
Is there a timeline or something where it's gonna be presented to the public before it's adopted? So there's no public input on that?
No, right now, there's not. I don't know if there will be. Yeah, right now it's under review. What I will do, there's my contact information. If you send me questions, I can get them routed to the right person. patricia.carney@cityoffortwayne.org. And I'll gladly give you my business card after the meeting, so you can contact me directly.
Okay. Any other questions?
I have to give you a self-promotion on the
Oh,
event on climate change.
yes. Thank you for reminding me. That's great.
This is a non-paid political announcement. No, I'm kidding. There is an event that's sponsored by multiple organizations, one of which is the Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light, happening October 10th in Noblesville at Teeter Farms. It's a faith climate summit, and it is for people of any faith and no faith. So it truly is inclusive, although we use moral type language. And so I can give you the QR code for information to register for that summit. And I also am happy to give you the QR code for a declaration that we are having faith leaders and anybody to sign on to create more impetus for especially our state legislators to move forward on climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency. So I urge you, no matter what your faith affiliation is, to get the QR codes, and then you can share them with others. October 10th, please join me.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Okay. I know climate change, it's something in environmental science we call a wicked problem because there aren't easy solutions, and it feels like everything that we do contributes to it, which is hard. But I really appreciate Pat and Melissa joining us today. I think it was a good conversation to start, and hopefully our community is moving forward with some mitigation and adaptation strategies. Okay, thank you guys.